Well, hello and welcome. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here tonight. But just as important, all of you who are brave enough to show up to talk about Wisconsin's gangster history from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, stop my video for a bit. I will share my screen. Hopefully all of you can now see Wisconsin's Gangster Past on your screen. Yep. You can hear me. And again, my name is Chad Lewis. As you heard, I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from roadside attractions to odd places, weird people. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. And what I found on my travels is that looking for the bizarre, sometimes you find it where you least expect that it's going to pop up. So as you see, as I traveled around looking for these weird places, it wasn't until the early 2000s when I was up in the Northwoods of Wisconsin working on a book about haunted places. My car popped a tire, so I got out and fixed the flat, worked up a thirst, and there was a lodge right across the street. So I thought I'd drop in and grab a can of pop. Well, lo and behold, that place was called Little Bohemia. I didn't know it at the time, but it seemed as though fate had stepped in and provided a little detour from things that go bump in the night to things that will bump you off. And that's what became the book and the program you're going to see this evening. And I really want this program to be a time portal back to the days when the gangsters robbed our banks, they kidnapped our citizens, and they mowed down everybody who got in their way. So for the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to travel around the state and explore Wisconsin's gangster history. Now, of course, the gangsters themselves, they're no longer at any of these locations, but the buildings themselves, the history, all of that is still there. But for how much longer, I don't know. I always encourage people to go to these places while you still can, because every year we're losing more and more of these historic treasures. So I encourage you to get there before they're all gone. So with that in mind, let's explore the gangster history. So put on your zoot suit or your flapper dress as we explore why the gangsters decided to turn Wisconsin into their own personal criminal haven. And the first question we have to ask is, why Wisconsin? What was it about our state that the gangsters loved? Well, there were numerous reasons, as you'll see tonight. The first being our close proximity to Chicago, which during Prohibition was the bootlegging capital of the world, mainly operated by Al Capone on your left and his arch nemesis, George Bugs Moran, on your right. A lot of people are familiar with Al. There we go. In part.
Sorry, Chad.
No problem. It pops up on my screen so I can just pop back on. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where Al knew that his nemesis, Bugs Moran, was using this building as a makeshift headquarters, and he wanted to get rid of Moran. So Al came up with a great idea. While he was vacationing down in Florida with an alibi, he'd have some of his colleagues dress up as police officers and raid Bugs's place. And that's what they did. They raided the hideout. Now, Bugs's men, they thought it was nothing more than your traditional police shakedown, that they would pay off the police and then go about their business as usual. But as soon as they put their weapons down, they realized this was not a typical shakedown, but it was too late. Capone's men opened fire on them. The garage had a dog, and after all the fighting, the dog was barking so loud that a neighbor lady sent one of her tenants over to find out what was going on, what all the commotion was about. Now, word of warning, there are probably 3 of these caution signs you'll see tonight. What they mean is that the next slide might be a little bit graphic, gory, or gruesome. You might not want to see it, so you can close your eyes. I will tell you when the photo's gone, but some of you might not want to see what's coming after the caution sign, because I'm going to show you what that dog was barking about. Because when the tenant came over to see what was going on, this is what he discovered. All of the men were dead or on the ground bleeding. Okay, the photo's gone. Bugs Moran wasn't there that day. He had seen the police coming and he turned around. And even though the case was never solved officially, when the media asked Bugs Moran who he thought was responsible, he said there's only one man in the world who kills like that, and that's Capone. We'll catch up with Al a little bit later. But years ago, Chicago was trying to clean up its gangster history, so it tore down the building of the Valentine's Day Massacre. It's now the front yard of a senior center area, as you can see here. But don't fret, like anything, you can go online and buy a brick from the original Valentine's Day Massacre if you like. The second reason they loved Wisconsin was they loved St. Paul. And the best way to get from Illinois to St. Paul, Minnesota was through Wisconsin. They loved St. Paul because of this man, Police Chief John O'Connor. Back in the early 1900s, when every other community was trying to keep criminals away, O'Connor took a different approach. He invited criminals to St. Paul. So if you were a criminal from anywhere in the U.S., you could go to St. Paul, register with the police, and do whatever the heck you wanted. Prostitution, no problem. Gambling, be our guest. But there was one catch to this agreement. You couldn't do it in the city of St. Paul. If you wanted to head to Wilmer, Minnesota, and rob their banks, which you can see they did, you were free to do so, but there'd be no crime inside of St. Paul. Therefore, in the 1920s and 30s, there were more crooks living in the saintly city than nearly anywhere else in the world. Yet it was safer for you to live in St. Paul than nearly anywhere else as well. In fact, so many criminals were in St. Paul that noted bank robber Alvin Karpis once said that if he was thinking of a friend of his that he hadn't seen in a while, he immediately thought of 2 places, prison or St. Paul, because if his friend wasn't in one, he was probably in the other one. And the third and most important reason they loved Wisconsin is the same reason we love Wisconsin, the beautiful Northwoods. When both the literal and figurative heat was too much on them and down south, they would come up to this cool and seclusion of the Northwoods. You can't throw a rock in Wisconsin without hitting a place that is thought to be tied to Al Capone. It was said that he owned this old hotel in Maribel, Wisconsin, that up in Door County, the Shipwrecked Brew Pub, near Pipe, Capone's restaurant there, Manitowoc, another bar and grill. Even this home in Brookfield was said to be owned by Al Capone. The house is pretty easy to find. Just look for it. It sits on Capone Court. But one place we do know Al spent time was the aptly named hideout near Hayward and Couturier. This is where Al had a beautiful cabin constructed in the Northwoods where he could come up with his friends and colleagues and relax in the beauty and seclusion of the Northwoods. Both Al and his brother Ralph Bottles Capone were avid outdoorsmen. They loved to hunt and fish, as did many men of that era, even though they were big city gangsters. But for Al, security was his number one concern, which is why he had this tower constructed on the property. 24 hours a day, he'd have his men in the tower with their Tommy guns watching the entrances and exits of the estate, meaning that if you tried showing up to Al's uninvited, you'd probably get a very unwelcome response. After Al lost the place, it went on to become a roadside attraction, a tourist destination that you could visit and pay and go see. Those who did often were a little weirded out, wondering what this building was used for. At first glance, they had no idea. But when they got closer, they realized this is where Al did a lot of his negotiating with his competitors. He would bring them up, and if they did not see his way of doing things, he'd throw them in jail, and they'd probably end up in the private lake at the bottom of that lake where Al had spirits flown in from Canada. Without a doubt, the deadliest gangsters ever to set foot in Wisconsin was that of the Barker-Karpis Gang, made up mainly of Alvin Creepy Karpis, remember prisoner St. Paul, and whatever Barker boys happened to be out of prison at the time. But before we talk about the gang, we have to address the legend of the Barker's mother, Ma Barker. Many of you are probably familiar with the legend of Ma, and it goes something like this. Ma was this mastermind gun-toting criminal who took her young, innocent boys off on a life of crime, turning them into criminals and killers. While nothing could be further from the truth, we know Ma traveled with her boys. She had to have known they were criminals, but she had no active role in the participation or planning of any of the crimes. We will catch up with Ma a little bit later down in Florida, and you'll see how the legend of Ma Barker began. But where she lacked in her criminal intent, her kids more than made up for it. What Karpis was doing chumming with the Barker brothers, I don't know. Karpis was thought to be the most intelligent gangster of all time. So why he was running with the Barkers, who let's just say were not the most intelligent, maybe that's why they loved one another. I don't know. But when they came to the Midwest, trouble seemed to follow them. You might recall that this was the gang that back in 1933 kidnapped William Hamm of the Hamm's brewing fortune. They kept him for a $100,000 ransom, quite a sum of money back then. They treated him pretty well. They fed him. They even brought him beer. It wasn't Hamm's. They didn't want to torture the poor guy, but they let him go. 6 months later, they did the same thing with Edward Bremer from the Bremer banking fortune. They got a $200,000 ransom from him. But they didn't like kidnapping. They thought it was beneath them. They liked robbing banks. They only did the kidnapping because it was easy and it provided them money to pay off the police and politicians, and it would give them safe homes throughout the Midwest. This one in St. Paul is still there. They were renting this place under the guise of being musicians traveling with their senior mother, although none of them ever played in a band. But the landlady had a son who worked at a speakeasy, and it was slow one evening. He happened to be flipping through an old detective magazine when all of a sudden he saw a wanted poster for those musicians living next to his mother. He immediately went down to the police station and said, "I'm here to collect the reward. The Barker-Karpis gang's renting my mom's house." They put him in the back room and said, "Don't worry, you're going to be a hero. We'll take care of this with one phone call." Unfortunately, word got to Big Tom Brown, perhaps the most corrupt police officer in Midwest history. But even though he was corrupt, he was a man of his word. He said he'd take care of it with one phone call, and he did. Guess who he called? The Barker-Karpis Gang. He said, "The feds are going to raid your place. Get out of there." That's what they did. They had no idea it was this wanted poster that had done them in. They thought it was Ma's boyfriend, Mr. Dunlop. He was an alcoholic, and when he became intoxicated, he would often brag about the exploits of the gang. So the Barker-Karpis gang thought he was too hot for Minnesota. They had to get him out of there before he caused too much more trouble. Why not take him on a nice little vacation to Wisconsin? But this wasn't the type of vacation you'd want to go on, because this was one of those vacations you didn't come back from. They brought him up near Webster in the Siren area to a place called Fremstead Lake, photographed here, and they shot him several times, dumped his naked body on the side of the lake, sprinkled a bunch of money on it to make it look like a mob hit. Years later, after retiring, the local sheriff used to go around town jokingly saying that this was the most profitable case he never investigated. They didn't care. It was just another dead gangster. When I dug up Dunlop's death certificate, they had to list his occupation, which is about midway down on your left-hand side of your screen, where you can see they wrote unknown, suspected underworld character. Kind of a cool title to have back then, although it usually meant you'd be dead on the side of a lake. But when the gangsters weren't robbing banks and kidnapping us, they liked to relax at all the speakeasies that were around during Prohibition. And in Wisconsin, they littered everywhere. Speakeasies, of course, were places you could go during Prohibition and illegally drink, gamble, dance the night away, maybe partake in one of the ladies of the night that worked at these establishments. And again, in Wisconsin, we had so many speakeasies that I think in our state, Prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law. One of their favorite places in all of Wisconsin was a place called Ma Bailey's House of Ill Repute. Actually, they just called it Ma Bailey's at the time. It's in Woodruff, just north of Minocqua, in what is now a heavily touristed area. What would happen is the gangsters would go into Minocqua and spend their night at places like the Belle Isle, and then they'd go eat at Norwood Pines Supper Club, which is still there for you to go eat at. And when they got bored and tired of eating at the supper club, they'd go out and spend the rest of their time at Ma's house in the wilderness. It had a reputation of being a fine establishment, but it was risque. It had nude murals on the walls, all kinds of risque behavior going on out there. But it had a long and wide reputation. And you might be thinking, how in the heck can a brothel operate in the Northwoods of Wisconsin? Because it made it almost until 1950. And this next story may illustrate why it survived as long as it did. Two young men were coming home from a road trip from Rhinelander. They decided to stop into Ma's to see what all the fuss was about. But as soon as they walked in, they said, we got to get out of here, because there was an X-rated movie being shown on the screen. And they said, if we get caught out here with an X-rated movie, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. But then the lights came up, they relaxed, had a few beers. The reason being is that when the lights came up, they realized the man running the projector was the town judge. Therefore, Ma Bailey's was never shut down, because everyone who could shut it down was out at Ma Bailey's. Eventually, they got her the same way they got Al Capone: tax evasion. They were not upset that she was running a brothel in Wisconsin. They were upset they weren't getting a cut of that brothel in Wisconsin. After it shut down, it went on to become a bar and grill, a restaurant, and many other things over the years. Eventually, it made its way back into private hands, where it is today. But I keep an eye on this property. Every once in a while, it does come onto the market. So if you're looking for a place to own that has a unique and weird Wisconsin history to it, or maybe you're looking to start your own brothel, you may want to keep an eye for Ma's place up in the Northwoods. And if you're ever bored on a rainy day, or I don't know, during a pandemic, I recommend you start flipping through the old Prohibition era newspapers. Most of them are online. The library has subscriptions to a lot of them and can help you with that. But you'd be amazed at how much crime was happening every single day during the Prohibition era. It's just completely amazing. And most of the criminals, they had no business doing what they did. They were terrible at it. They didn't plan it out. They were captured right away. They got long prison terms. They shouldn't have ever been in a life of crime. But others seem to be born to be criminals, which brings us to our next gangster, John Dillinger, perhaps the most infamous gangster of all time. If you don't recall Dillinger's story, he was a bank robber back in 1933 and 1934, perhaps the most famous bank robber of all time. Back then, they used to show his wanted poster before movies like trailers are shown today. And believe it or not, people would stand up and start cheering for Dillinger like he was some folk hero robbing from the banks. But regardless of what you make of Dillinger, when he came to Wisconsin, trouble seemed to follow him. First stop, November of 1933 in Racine. Dillinger and his gang wanted to make a withdrawal from the American Bank and Trust. In fact, they wanted to take every penny the bank had. So on the day of the robbery, they pulled around back of the building, which looks like this today. And their game plan was to leave the getaway car in the back with their getaway driver, Russell Clark. But this meant that they would have to rob the bank and come all the way around the block to get to their getaway car instead of going through the tiny back door. But whether they didn't know this or they didn't care, maybe they were bored with their lives, even though they were bank robbers, they decided to go through with the plan anyway. They left the car running with Russell Clark. Meanwhile, Dillinger and his gang, which at the time was made up of Harry Pierpont, Three-Finger Jack John Red Hamilton, and Charles Makley, went into the bank. Makley was the first one in. He went right up to the counter, and the teller was counting out change. Makley said, "This is a stick-up. Give us all your money." The teller, thinking it was a joke, didn't even look up. Without even looking at him, he said, "Next window, please." Makley shot him in the shoulder. That got his attention. It also signaled the alarm, and a crowd started gathering out front of the building. The gangsters ordered everybody down to the ground. One of the biggest misconceptions about bank robberies of this era was the whole stick 'em up. Most banks had big front windows, meaning that anybody walking by could see everybody with their hands up, and they would know it was a robbery, and they would alert the police. So instead, they would throw you to the ground. But this was for Makley shooting the man. It got the attention of the police, and they raced to the scene. Well, not exactly. You see, back then, false alarms were very common at banks. So the police took their time getting there. When they got there, they were held hostage like everybody else. Normally, the gangsters like to take the young female clerk tellers and use them as shields on their driving, on the running boards of their cars, because they believed, rightly so, that the police would be less likely to shoot them if they had young female girls as shields. So that's what they did. They grabbed a young teller and the bank manager and a security guard, and they made their way to their car. And they stormed out of town and they got away because they had a very high-tech way of eluding the police. And it was this. In the back seat of their car, they would keep a big bucket of roofing nails. Back then, police had no two-way radios, so all they could do was chase you. So the gangsters would throw these nails on the road on their way out of town. And when the police would follow them, they would pop their tires and the chase would be over. That's exactly what Dillinger did as he made his way back to his safe house in Milwaukee. Today, it is no longer a bank. It is now the Racine Art Museum, or the RAM. But they still have the original bank vault on display. If you use a Speakeasy password, they might even let you go into the vault and check it out. After the robbery, they collected all the artifacts, the weapons, the bullet casings. They put it all together with a lot of the newspaper clippings and made it into a memorial for the bank robbery and John Dillinger. But my favorite part is where they decided to put this memorial. Because what better place to put a memorial for the greatest bank robber in U.S. history? Well, the only place you'd want that memorial would be right in the front lobby of your police department. That's exactly where it is today. But I have to warn you, those of you who are currently on the lam from the law, this is a working police station, so you may want to avoid this place and move on to our next location. Which brings us to this gentleman, Lester Gillis, better known as George Babyface Nelson. Out of all the gangsters I researched, I had the most fun researching and the most trouble researching this gentleman. The reason being is that I never knew what side of Babyface was going to pop up. On the one hand, those who knew him said he was a polite, well-mannered, jovial young man. He was also perhaps the best connected gangster of all time. If you needed a weapon, a safe house, or an introduction to a fellow crook, he could provide it all. And at a time when all of the gangsters had numerous mistresses, the malls as they were called, Babyface was said to be very devoted to his wife Helen and their two young children. But before you start thinking of Babyface as some sort of angel, remember I said there was a flip side, and that flip side was his temper. Many of his own colleagues did not like working with him because they never knew what he was going to do. When they robbed a bank and had to spread out the money, they would form a circle, put him in the middle, and let him divvy up the loot. He thought it was because he was in charge. But in actuality, they formed a circle around him because nobody wanted their back to him, thinking he might just shoot you and take your portion of the bank robbery. But when Babyface came to Wisconsin, we got to see both sides of him. First stop, he's traveling with his wife and their good friend following behind, Tommy Carroll and his wife at the time. They're driving up north and they made it just to North Leeds. And at this intersection, Babyface got into an accident with a truck employee from a local canning facility. Tommy Carroll pulled his car off the road about 100 yards back, thinking Babyface is just going to shoot the guy and we'll go about our business. Instead, Babyface got out of his car, went into the North Leeds grocery store pictured here, made a telephone call, and then he came back out and said, let's go into town and get our cars fixed. Meanwhile, years later, that North Leeds grocery store turned into Thirsty's Bar and Grill. But remember, in the beginning, I told you to get to these places while you still can. A couple years ago, a fire burned down Thirsty's, and this is all that is left where you can see where Babyface made his phone call. So they went into Arlington to this location, the Arlington Bell Ford dealership, which is still owned by the same family today, although they've moved to a different building recently. But the building's still there. Babyface went into the building. He had his back to the wall the entire time. Nobody knew who he was, but once his picture was released days later, everybody recognized him and that he wouldn't move from his back to the wall, which makes sense. When you're a gangster, when your back's to the wall, nobody can sneak up on you and arrest you or shoot you from behind. Meanwhile, Tommy Carroll is parked across the street. He went into the Arlington Bar and Grill and started drinking like a fish, thinking at any moment, Babyface is going to shoot up the town and we're going to have a gunfight on our hands. But somehow, Babyface kept it together, paid for the cars being repaired, and then made his way out of town. He was driving a bit with his wife when they made it to Portage, Wisconsin, and they broke down right out in front of a garage named A.R. Slinger's Garage. Today, it is ironically a liquor store, but the footprint's still the same. Instead of having spirits on display, they would have had the vehicles right here. Babyface left his car there and said, I'll come back for it when it's repaired. He never would. The FBI would get it. Babyface and his wife hopped in with Tommy Carroll, and together the two couples drove up to Little Bohemia, Manitwish Waters, where my car popped that tire so many years ago. It was April of 1934, which meant it was the off season, completely dead. It wasn't filled with Chicago tourists like it is today. So the owners were very excited when a group of men pulled up, wanting to rent the building for the entire weekend. Money was no object. In fact, the owners said the men were throwing around money as though they had just robbed a bank. That should have been their first clue. But again, they needed that business. But their excitement soon turned to fear when they noticed who walked through the front door. Because in 1934, these were the last people you'd want at your establishment. A who's who of gangsters. Top left corner, John Dillinger. Top right, Babyface Nelson. Bottom right, Tommy Carroll. Middle bottom, Three-Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton. And on the left bottom, Homer Van Meter. Deadly, deadly men. If the FBI could capture these men, they could throw away their most wanted list. Of course, they had the softer side with them, the malls. And in the beginning, the owners were happy. The men were buying all the rounds. They were tipping really well. They were telling amazing stories. The only thing that bothered them is they all seemed to have a large lump on the side of their jackets. But don't worry, they would figure out what those lumps were because they made the mistake of smuggling out information that Dillinger was in the Northwoods. Word got down to Chicago's FBI division, which was run by Melvin Purvis here. Purvis flew into Rhinelander, Wisconsin, getting dark, drove over to Voss's Birchwood Lodge with his deputies, and there they were about to make a game plan as to how best capture Dillinger. But they got word that instead of leaving the next morning as planned, Dillinger was about to leave at any moment. He had an uncanny knack of knowing when things weren't quite right. So all they could do was drive over and wait for Dillinger to come out and try to arrest him. Unfortunately for them, a little after 9 p.m. when they got there, 3 local men who had been eating and drinking went out to their car to go home. The feds panicked. They thought it was Dillinger. They opened fire on this car, killing one of the men, injuring the other 2. Well, now chaos erupted at Little Bohemia. Babyface, who was staying in the side cabin because nobody wanted him in the main cabin, could have easily snuck into the woods undetected. Instead, he came out guns blazing, and we'll catch up with him in a bit because he provided Dillinger and his men enough time to avoid all of the gunfire that was coming into the building and enough time to escape. How did they escape? What was their elaborate escape plan? It was this. They crawled out the back window. The federal authorities, while trying to capture the most elusive men in the world, simply forgot to cover the back door. Everyone got away. They didn't know there was this ravine going down to the lake where the gangsters could run undetected. Tommy Carroll just hitchhiked his way back to Minneapolis. Meanwhile, Dillinger took off running with Three-Finger Jack and Homer Van Meter. At gunpoint, they were able to borrow a car from a gentleman and wanted to get back to St. Paul. But because every radio station in America was broadcasting stories of Babyface shooting up the Northwoods, they had to go through the southern town of Hastings, Minnesota. And when they went over this bridge, the police recognized the plates as being stolen, and they chased them. They had a 20-mile gun battle in which they were shooting at the gangsters back and forth. Finally, Homer Van Meter swerved the car off the road and got away. Later, the feds would find their abandoned vehicle. Judging by the amount of blood you see photographed here, they believe whoever was sitting in the front seat of that car would probably die from their wounds. And they were right. Three-Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton, did die from his wounds. Back at Little Bohemia, Babyface should have had the easiest way out, but instead he had the hardest time. He got out, he was able to steal a car, and it broke down. As he was walking to grab another car to steal, he noticed a bunch of people standing around, and he was going to walk to them to steal their vehicle. That's when a police car pulled up with an FBI agent and a local sheriff's deputy. They had no idea who was who was a local, who wasn't. So Babyface, according to legend, walked over and said, "I know you're wearing vests, so I'm going to give it to you both high and low." In reality, he probably just started shooting without any warning. Then he kicked them out of their vehicle and he drove off in their car. Later that night, the FBI agent would die from his gunfight with Babyface. The sheriff's deputy, he spent the next several months in hospital trying to recover from his gunfight. Luckily, he did survive. Babyface drove their car for a while until it broke down. Then he started walking. For over 20 miles in the pitch black forest, he walked until he came to this peninsula near Lac de Flambeau. That's when he ran into Ollie Catfish and his family. He stayed in their lodge for a couple nights, and then he tore off down to Chicago. Right across the lake from where Ollie Catfish lived is Dillman's Lodge Resort. And sometime in the late 1930s, early 1940s, they don't know exactly when, they bought that lodge and hauled it over on horse and sleigh and brought it to the resort where it is to this very day, cabin number 5, that you can spend the night in the very same room that Babyface slept in so many years ago. Back at Little Bohemia, the feds thought everyone was captured. So when they shot tear gas in a few hours later, they were disappointed to see the only people coming out were the malls and the employees. Much to the credit of Little Bohemia, they kept all the artifacts, the weapons, the personal shaving, the clothing, all of that of the gangsters is still on display. They even kept the original bullet holes in the windows that you can go and see for yourself. But the gangsters couldn't go on forever. Death caught them, and it caught them very quickly. Imagine you're at the Biograph Theater in Chicago, when the guy sitting next to you looks a heck of a lot like John Dillinger. And it was Dillinger. He didn't know it at the time, but he was being set up by a friend of his named Anna Sage. She was a Romanian and being threatened with deportation. So she thought if she could turn in Dillinger, not only would she get the reward, they'd have to let her stay in America as well. So that's what she did. She turned in Dillinger. And for her reward, the U.S. government shipped her back to Romania. Here's where things get weird, though. The FBI version of events is that when the movie was over, Dillinger came out, he saw that they were waiting for him, and he tried to run into this alleyway and shoot them, but they were just too quick, and they shot him, and he bled to death waiting for help to arrive. Witnesses that night tell a different story of a well-dressed man being shot basically without warning and dying, bleeding to death in this alleyway. Regardless of whether either versions are true, Dillinger died in this alleyway. Immediately, people started gathering under the Biograph. They got Johnny. They got Dillinger. Can you believe it? But they didn't stop there. They followed into the alleyway. Now, word of caution again, the next slides are going to be a little graphic. If you'd rather not see them, please close your eyes. I'll tell you when they're gone. Because this is what the people did in the alleyway. They dipped their handkerchief or newspaper into the blood of Dillinger as some sort of grisly souvenir. When they were done there, they followed him to the morgue. Women cut locks of his hair. More blood was stolen, and photographs of his nearly naked body were captured. Okay, the photos are gone. The next to go was Babyface Nelson. He needed a little vacation, so he wanted to go to Lake Geneva to the Lake Como Hotel, which was a sprawling resort. He had stayed there many times before because it was run and operated by a gangster. But as soon as he pulled in, the feds were there waiting for him. But amazingly, they didn't recognize who he was. So he turned around and drove off. As he went through Lake Geneva, he saw several other FBI agents walking around town. So he decided to make his way back to Chicago. He was with his wife and his good buddy, John Paul Chase. On their way back to Chicago, they saw 2 carloads of FBI agents coming up from Chicago to Lake Geneva. For some unknown reason, Babyface swerved his car off the road onto their road, ran one of them into a ditch. The other car he ran into a park in Barrington, north of the Chicago suburbs. As he gets out of his car, he starts walking toward their vehicle. He's shooting them, they're shooting him. By the time he reaches their vehicle, he realizes they're in no condition to fire back, so he kicks them out of their car, and with blood oozing out of all the bullet holes in his body, he drives off in their vehicle. Later, both of those agents would die from their gun battle with Babyface. The next day, Babyface's dead body was found on the side of the road. I'm going to show you his morgue photo. If you'd rather not see it, close your eyes. Here's Babyface dead at the age of 25. Okay, photo's gone. The last of the big names to go was Ma and Fred Barker. They were renting this home down in Florida along the lake. The neighbors thought they were the best neighbors you could have. They didn't know they were gangsters, of course, but they loved that they would give rides in their fancy automobiles and hand out coins and candy to the local kids. The FBI found out that Ma and Fred were staying there. According to their version of events, they knocked on the door, and when Ma answered, they asked her to surrender peacefully, which her reply was, "Let's see what Freddie and his guns have to say about surrendering." In reality, they opened fire without warning. Researchers of that era believe that Ma and Fred were killed in the first 30 seconds of the gun battle. But for the next several hours, every time the wind blew a curtain or a screen door, the government would start shooting up the place thinking it was the Barker gang. It went on for so long, neighbors started putting their lawn chairs in the front yard, watching it like it was some reality TV show. Eventually, after many hours of no gunfire coming from inside, the government finally got the courage to force the Barkers' hired maintenance man in to see what was going on. And that's when they discovered Ma was dead, unarmed senior with mild at best intelligence. And they thought to themselves, perhaps the general public would not like us going around shooting unarmed seniors. So they concocted the story that Ma was this mastermind criminal. Once word got out, those who knew Ma best told the media that that woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. But that's how the legend of Ma began. But regardless, she was dead with her son, Fred. Again, I'm going to show you their morgue photos. If you'd rather not see them, close your eyes. Here we go. Ma and Fred's bullet-riddled bodies at the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. As I said, the neighbors thought they were wonderful neighbors. Even after they found out they were gangsters, they named their local watering hole Ma Barker's Hideaway, where you can go there and do some shots or take some shots if you so choose. But besides being killed, the gangster era ended for three main reasons. One, obviously, the repeal of prohibition. Bootleggers who were making millions of dollars a year, that all dried up overnight. The second reason is the FBI got much better at fighting these men and women. Most agents, when they started out, were college graduates who had never fired a weapon in their entire lives. But they got much better very quickly at protecting us from these criminals. But the third and most important reason was because of us. When they were robbing banks, it seemed like nobody cared. When they were bootlegging, people cared even less. It wasn't until they started shooting us and killing us that we turned them in for the outrageous sums of money that were being offered for their capture. So it all leaves us with the question of, what do we make of these men and women? Were they criminals or folk heroes or something in between? That's where I leave it up to you to come to your own conclusion. But regardless of what you make of these men and women, I think what should be celebrated is the history in which they operated. They were truly the A-list celebrities of their day. Not only did they change laws in Wisconsin, they changed the laws throughout the country. And I think that's what should be celebrated rather than the characters themselves. And if you want more information, my website, chadlewisresearch.com, has more than you could ever want or need. But I really hope your adventure doesn't end here at the library. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions or comments. And please heed the advice of these next travelers, because in Wisconsin, who knows what could happen. So again, I want to thank the library for having me here. It's very rare you can come to a program like this at no cost. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here tonight, and they should be applauded, because I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more essential role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is the fabric that keeps our community together. A real treasure for anyone that has one. Just to show my appreciation, if you want to go to my website and get any of my books, just type in the coupon code LIBRARY. You'll save 20% off everything just because the library is so amazing. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll turn it over to the library. If you have questions, comments, or stories, you can either put them in the chat room or unmute yourself and ask the question or tell the story on your own. So let me stop sharing and I'll turn it back to the library.
That was fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording.